Okay, hi there. So today's speaker is Louise Firth. Louise is a lecturer in marine ecology at Plymouth, where she's been since 2015. But I noticed that she's moved around an amount prior to that as part of her career. And in fact, I've met Louise previously at the Porky-Rock Pine Marine Natural History conference, and I know she has although she's a marine, says she's a marine ecologist, she has a passion for, amongst other things, Sabellaria alveolata. And as I remember at that first conference, Louise, you were talking about your own work at Hilbury Island on the Dee estuary up there near Liverpool, Chester. But what Louise might not mention is that she's also been very prominent over the last several years in some work around enhancing the biodiversity of artificial structures in the marine environment, seawalls and the likes of that, by incorporating into them all sorts of small-scale habitats, crevices, holes, rock pools, and that, to allow for settlement and colonization of organisms. And hopefully we'll actually see some of that work here in North Devon, as it's planned to be incorporated into the new the sea defences at the new Ilfracombe Water Sports Centre that's coming up to be built. But just in case any of that it left you with the impression that Louise is some sort of dyed-in-the-wool academic, one of her latest papers is entitled "What Have Limpets Ever Done for Us?" Featuring the human limpet. But anyway, back to the main subject, Sabellaria alveolata. And so hopefully Louise is going to tell us a bit about why we should give some respect to this worm, which is one of the key species for which the marine conservation zones here in North Devon were designated. So Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Robin. I thoroughly enjoyed that introduction, and thank you for getting the limpet paper in. That's one I'm particularly proud of. No need for enhancement of artificial structures for Sabellaria alveolata. It thrives on them. Brilliant. No, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to minimize the faces just so I can actually see my screen. Great. All right. Yes. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, today I want to talk to you about one of my my many loves in the marine environment, Sabellaria alveolata, the honeycomb worm. So this is just a nice picture showing you a close-up of the worm itself, and you can see for obvious reasons why it's actually called the honeycomb worm, because it looks exactly like honeycomb. So no surprises there. So first of all, I just want to talk about who is the honeycomb worm. I've sort of structured this talk in a little bit of a who, what, where, when, why sort of structure. So let's talk about the who. So this is Sabellaria alveolata. The image on the right-hand side shows you what the worm itself looks like when it's out of its tube. So on the left-hand side, you can see a close-up of the tube structures of a colony of worms. Inside each of those individual tubes, you'll find a single worm, which looks like the individual on the right-hand side. If you see the image in the center, you can see a close-up of the structure of what the tubes look like. And you can see that it's formed of tiny little sand grains all glued together. So the worm, as it grows, it builds its tube to make it longer and bigger as it grows itself. And it uses a very strong mucus to actually glue the little sand grains together. And they're very picky about what sort of sand grains they choose to pick. They won't pick something that's too silty, and they won't pick something that's too big. So there's a bit of a Goldilocks element here of the size of the sand grains that they choose to build their tubes with. But the tubes are very beautiful in my eyes. I think they're very beautiful structures, and they're actually very strong structures as well. I'm sure many of you have touched, felt, and even stood on Sabellaria reefs, and they're quite strong. So the mucus that they use is actually really quite a special mucus to tie these sand grains together. If you look a bit closer at the tubes on the left-hand side, you can see some of them. I hope you can see my cursor there. Do you see these two tubes here? You can see this sort of outer sort of peak almost sticking out from the actual inner tube itself. If you can see that, you know that there's a live worm inside. So it's almost like the peak of a cap. And if you can see that, that's telling you that there's a live worm inside. Often you'll see the tubes left behind without live worms inside, but if you can see that structure there, that's telling you that the worm is in there, because they will actively constantly rebuild that bit to protect themselves. Like many marine organisms, they have a biphasic life cycle where they have a pelagic larval stage out in the water column, and they have a benthic stage adhering to rocks or sediments on the shore. So the larvae will spend anything from a few days to, some studies have even found that they can live up to 6 weeks in the water column, which is actually quite a long time. But when they're ready to settle, they basically they have a requirement for a hard substrate to settle onto, and if that hard substrate is suitable, they will metamorphose, and they will eventually sort of take up an adult life cycle or life stage in the benthos. In the image here on the right, you can see you've got a mixture of adults and lots of very new recruits. In between the tiny little tubes, which are the recruits, you can see much larger tubes here, and these are the adults that are obviously from maybe last year or previous years. This is quite a nice image showing you like really good recruitment. Each of those tiny little tubes will eventually become an adult worm. Of course, most of them will not survive, but you'll eventually end up with a structure that looks like the original picture I showed you. But yeah, you get a sense of the biphasic life cycle there. They can form many types of structures. Any organism that forms a structure, we call it a biogenic. So bio referring to life, and yeah, so Sabellaria forms what we call biogenic structures, and they have many different forms depending on the local environmental context. So this image here is just showing you what a crust form might look like. And this is where you have individual tubes just forming a layer or maybe a couple of layers on the rock surface there that you can see here. So it's very easy to see the individual tubes in this image here. And you can see the rock substrate underneath. So moving up in terms of scale, you also get what we refer to as veneers, which are these structures that basically just adhere to the rock, which can of course be vertical, or it can be horizontal as well, depending on the lay of the rock. Some of you, I'm sure, have been to Bude in North Cornwall. Bude is actually a really great place to go to see excellent examples of veneer structures. Really, really beautiful forms in Bude. They also can form hummocks depending on the local environment. So hummocks might form where you have boulders, for instance, surrounded by sand, like in the image here that you see here. And when the colonies are in full growth, they can actually form like almost like mushroom-like structures where they look like little mushrooms on the beach. If you go to France, they call them obviously champignons. In France, and yeah, you can see really beautiful mushroom structures in many places in France. And then of course, moving up in scale again, you can find some really large structures like this platform here that I have in the image here. Just to give you a bit of scale, I'm 5'4.5", which is the half is very important. And that structure is actually taller than me. I know it's taken from underneath, but that is just about taller than me. And it's not full of worms. So the worms will only be living in the very top, maybe 10 centimeters. What you're seeing in the image here is years and years of recruitment events where juveniles have settled in strata. So you'll have horizontal lines of recruitment events over time, but you will only find live worms living in the very top structure. That location there is in northern France, in the Bay of Mont Saint-Michel, and you have 3 regions where you have some really large structures forming of just Sabellaria alveolata. They're actually the largest biogenic reefs in the whole of Europe. So it's really quite special. Just the environmental conditions in Mont Saint-Michel Bay are, it's the perfect storm for Sabellaria. You've got a lot of sediment supply, which is important for the tube building. You have just the right level of wave exposure, and there are hard substrates for the juveniles to attach to. And of course, once you actually have Sabellaria itself, the tubes then form the hard structure. So you will have layers of juveniles living on top of other ones. So yeah, underneath that structure, there will be a rock of some sort that started the original reef. And so just talking a little bit about reef dynamics, just a little bit of the sort of terminology that we use in relation to describing how the bioconstructions form. We use the terms prograding and retrograding to describe the reefs. In the past, papers would have described growth phases and destruction phases, which isn't quite accurate, because it's not about destruction. It's just a natural cycle a lot of the time. Of course, when humans get involved and we trample the reefs, it can be expedited, and in some ways it could be classed as destruction, but it will naturally go through this cycle of growth where they're prograding and where there's a natural decline in the reef structures themselves, which we refer to as retrograding. So it can be completely natural, or it can be, of course, induced by humans or other damage as well. And you can see changes between the various different types of reefs as well. So you've heard me mention the veneers and hummocks and platform types. And of course, as the reefs go through their evolution, you can find that hummocks can turn into platforms, or veneers can turn into hummocks, and they can go through these sort of cyclical events where they can basically grow or decline back to one or the other. And like I say, that can be either natural or human induced as well. So next section is, where is it? So obviously going to start with Britain first. So in Britain, it's classed as a UK priority habitat. And obviously before this year, when we were in the EU, it was also classed in a British context as an EU Habitats Directive Annex 2 habitat, or sorry, Annex 1, that should be Annex 1 habitat. And if you look at OBIS or GBIF, or in this case, NBN, these are the big online repositories where people submit their records. This just shows you the distribution of presences in Britain. It doesn't tell you anything about the absences where it hasn't been found, but it does show you where the presences are. And you can see here that it's pretty much a West Coast species and a Southern species. Pretty much absent from the East Coast. And I would argue that probably maybe a lot of these records here might actually not be Sabellaria alveolata at all. They're probably more likely to be Spinulosa, the sister species, which is more commonly found in the subtidal. One of the problems with these online databases is that there are often mistakes, and records are submitted that may not actually be accurate. I would argue that the most northerly one here in Scotland, that is definitely not Sabellaria alveolata. I would argue that's Sabellaria spinulosa. The known range limit is here in southwest Scotland for this species. Local to you guys in North Devon, there are a couple of papers in the literature which you may or may not be familiar with. We met, some of us met at Blue Anchor during the summer, but there was this lovely paper that was published back in 1982, which was quite forward thinking, really. It describes the ostracod fauna associated with Sabellaria reefs at Blue Anchor. Ostracods are little tiny crustaceans, and there's very abundant populations of ostracods that are found in these reefs at Blue Anchor. But the interesting thing about this paper that was very forward thinking they actually looked at the tubes of individuals at Blue Anchor, and they were quantifying the amount of plastic that was actually used in the tube building. And that was back in 1982. And of course, I'm sure you're all very well aware of microplastics. They're in the media all the time at the moment. And that's a long time ago that somebody was actually looking at plastic in the marine environment. But yes, you know, nurdles, these little tiny bits of plastic, of course, can be used as, you know, surrogate sand grains to build tubes for this species. Another one that's fairly close by to you guys, of course, Hinkley Power Station, where you have the outfall there, warmer water going into the marine environment. Sabellaria alveolata being a more southerly form, and that is thought to, it's expected to benefit from climate change and warming temperatures. This paper found that in the area where the outfall was coming out onto the shore, the Sabellaria reefs were actually growing much bigger and faster than they were in the colder areas elsewhere on the shore. So just an interesting paper describing a sort of, I suppose, an almost a benefit for a species from humans and ultimately linked to climate change as well. It's not only impacted by warm weather and warm events. It's actually in the northern part of its range. It's very susceptible to cold weather. So I don't know how many of you guys were around in 1962, 63. I wasn't, but I feel like I was, because I've learned a lot about this very cold winter since working on Sabellaria, actually. This image here is showing you the Menai Strait during the cold winter 1962-63. And what you can see there are these ice flows in the Menai Strait. And clearly that is not something that we see very often in this part of the world. I know in Kent, there was some very severe weather. I gathered that this winter lasted from December all the way through to March. And the average temperature within a day never got above 1. In Kent, the sea froze for a mile out to sea. So it was a really, really extreme event. And maybe some of you might remember it. But it had a drastic and long-lasting effect on Sabellaria alveolata. The map here on the right-hand side shows you the work that Robin was describing that I spoke about at the Porcupine meeting a few years ago. We were looking at the past and present distribution of Sabellaria around the Cumbria and North Wales coastline. And each of the dots here show you a sampling site that we visited. The quadrants in the pies basically show you, the top right is pre-1962-63. The second pie piece is 1980s. The third pie piece is the early 2000s. And the fourth pie piece is a study that I did in the early 2010s. And what you can take from this map here is basically showing you that it was present all along it was present in parts of North Wales, and it was present along the Cumbria coastline in pre-1962-63. We don't have data from all of the locations, so where you have a little gap in the pie chart, that there was no data, there was no sampling done at that time. But in many places you can see that, look at these red ones here. For the 1962-63, so 1980s data, there's a gap, okay? So it's white showing you that there was no Sabellaria present. The darker color shows you the more abundance. So what happened was, it was present in many places prior to 1962-63. When people came back to look in the 1980s, it had actually disappeared from a large number of locations in the region. And it actually took about 40 years for it to recover. So in the 2000s, when people were looking again, as you can see in these red circles here, it had actually come back. And then it came back with a vengeance then, you know, later on when I came along. So a warm water species, its southerly form, a very, very cold winter event in a cold part of the Irish Sea, importantly. In many places, it was actually wiped out. There were local extirpations throughout a really large part of its range, and that was very long lasting for about 40 years. So cold weather events can be really detrimental to this species. And actually in that study that I'm showing you the map here from, we also looked at the sort of more shorter term impacts of the cold winters of 2009-10 and 10-11, and we did find evidence to suggest that it was impacted by those cold winters as well, but nowhere near as badly as the 1962 winter. So just taking you to Ireland for a few minutes, I did a stint in Galway on the west coast of Ireland. This is Galway here, just right in the middle on the west coast. And on arrival, having worked with Sabellaria in the UK, I recognised a bit of a knowledge gap in Ireland. We had very few records on the global databases. I think the number was, there was something like 2,800 records available for Britain, but the island of Ireland only had a total of 41 records in total. So I took it upon myself to fill that gap and find out where it was and survey, not just survey, but I also pulled together all of the old papers and grey literature reports, museum specimens, anything that I could find to piece together the distribution in Ireland. And I'm pleased to say that was well worth doing, because after that, the 41 records turned into 981, and they spanned 182 years. And when you map them, they looked like what you can see on the right. And you can see here, all of the white little circles are showing you not scenes. So we surveyed, but we didn't find it. And then the greens are showing you where it was. And the AC, the SAC for all of the letters here are basically, A is for abundant, C is common, F is frequent, O is occasional, rare, present, and not seen. So the darker the color shows you the greater abundance of the species. But you can see it basically only lived in 6 hotspots. And I was really, first of all, confused by this. And I thought, hey, this is weird. How do I explain this distribution? But thinking about it and knowing what I knew about the sites that I visited and knowing where it was and where it wasn't, I had a fairly good idea about why it was in certain places and not others. But we didn't stop there. I worked with some very talented modelers in France, and they took a lot of environmental data. So they took information on temperature, substrate, wave action, wave height, salinity, all sorts of things to try to put it into a model to explain the probability of its distribution. And in the end, after I think it was 15 variables went into the model, 4 came out as really important for Sabellaria. The first one was wave height. So it's a bit of a Goldilocks situation with wave height. Too little is not good for Sabellaria. So for example, on the east coast of Ireland, you have quite low wave action. The too much is not good for Sabellaria, but in the middle there's a sweet spot where wave action is really is key. So for a lot of these west coast examples, so like Donegal on the northwest coast, most of Mayo and Galway here in the middle, and a lot of the southwest, they're very, very exposed to wave action. And arguably, this way it's too exposed for Sabellaria. It just will not do well in these environments. Tidal amplitude. So you have different sort of tidal amplitudes around the coast of Ireland. You have quite big amplitudes on the west coast, for instance. And this patch here in the northeast, it's actually a bit of, I wouldn't say it's micro tidal, but it has a very small tide. The tide only comes in and goes out a little bit in comparison to other areas around the coast. So the actual amount that the tide comes in or out is very important for this species as well. Stratification links to a little bit to temperature, but also to tidal fronts. So these are oceanographic features that can basically, they separate warm and cold water. And we have lots of warm and cold water around the coast. I'm going to show you on the next slide where that is. And substrate came out as a very important feature, which is not surprising. In areas where you have sediment, for instance, with no rock, it's not good for Sabellaria, for instance. It needs the rock and the sediment supply nearby, but importantly, it needs hard substrate to begin with. So if we just sort of look at the distribution in relation to the mixed and stratified water, which is linked to temperature. So just the red bits here show you the distribution. Okay, so this is where it is. Everywhere else is where it isn't. If you look at the black line all around the coast, this is basically showing you the distribution of rocky shore. And you can see here on the east coast where you don't have Sabellaria, this is predominantly sedimentary shore, which is not good for Sabellaria, which can help to explain why it's not here. But note these big black lines. Okay, so you see here in the Irish Sea, you've got the Western Irish seafront. To the north, you've got the Islay front, and to the south, you've got the Celtic seafront here, coming off the south coast here. And note the shading on either side of these fronts. Okay, you've got the horizontal lines are showing you stratified water, and you've got this little patch of stratified water to the west of the Western Irish seafront. Stratified water is where during the summer, you get this stratification of the water. Okay, so on the top layer, it's quite calm and it heats up readily in the summer. So you've got this warm water on top of colder water underneath. And Sabellaria alveolata, being an intertidal species, it interacts with that layer of warm water. Where you've got the mixed water, which you have here in the north of Ireland and throughout the Irish Sea here, you have mixed water, which typically is mixing up the water and it's much cooler. So the surface water is cold. And if you superimpose temperature on this, this is kind of what it looks like. Okay, I've cherry picked a good example here. So July 2017, you can see here the warmer colors here represent warmer water, and the cooler waters, or the cooler colors, represent cooler water. And you can see here on the south coast, you've got this patch of really warm water, much cooler around the headlands of the southwest, much warmer here in sort of the Galway Bay area, and again in Donegal Bay. Nice little patch of warm water here to the west of the Western Irish seafront, really cold water to the north, and much cooler water south of it again. So the Irish Sea is just, it's actually a really cold area with this nice little patch of warm water, which is really important for this population of Sabellaria in the northeast. So lots of things to consider that are very important for this species. It's a very picky species. It will not live everywhere, but when the conditions are right, it thrives. And this is something that we found with this study. But of course, other species do also show similar distributions as well. Forcus lineatus, which is a type of snail. So this is the top shell, the toothed top shell, actually shows a very similar distribution in Ireland. It's absent from much of the Irish Sea, but it's present in this little warm patch here. And its range edge is also at Malin Head in the north as well. There's various seaweeds that also show a similar distribution. So yeah, Sabellaria is not unique in having these sort of unique distributions around the Irish coastline. So that northeast population was quite interesting because if you actually drill down into it, we found that it was actually very vulnerable, and humans were a very important part of this story. Some of the oldest records from this area enabled us to actually look back in time and actually look to actually identify places where it had been in the past, but had disappeared. And this map here on the right shows you, the green is showing you locations where it was consistently found over time. The boxes with the numbers show you the year of the last time that it was observed. So you can see some in the 2000s, but you can also see some very old records here. There's an 1872, and further south, you've got a few from the very early 1900s. And of course, these are associated with the X's, which are showing you places where this species has basically disappeared, and it's been extirpated for various reasons. In this region, the key things that are considered to be important for driving the loss of this species are cold winters. And there's something to be said for possibly the cold wind of 1962-63 playing a role maybe further north here, and also these ones down in the south as well. But in the region as well, trampling from harvesters, so people going out collecting winkles, for instance, are very detrimental to the reefs in the region as well. But just to sort of show you some evidence of how the structures used to look like in some of the area. This is a lovely piece of text from an old paper from 1910 that you can read here, and I've highlighted the key text here. So on the strand between Portmarnock and Malahide, so these are two locations in North County Dublin, they can be seen in great masses covering the rocks and forming quite a conspicuous feature in the landscape. I've been back to Portmarnock and Malahide and everything in between, and I couldn't find it anywhere. But clearly you can see from this language in this text that it was a conspicuous feature, forming great masses on the shore. Arguably, they sound like quite healthy, happy reefs, which have completely disappeared. Undoubtedly, development and urbanization will, of course, have had an impact on this species as well. So this is just showing you the sort of global distribution of this species. And as you can see here, the UK, so this is from 2017, before that Irish paper that I'm talking about. If my data were incorporated into this map, there'd obviously be a lot more around the island of Ireland. But it just shows you the sort of known distribution elsewhere. This does not mean that it is completely absent from France or absent from Portugal. It's actually all over all of these coasts. We just don't have the records. I think the sort of take-home message here is Britain is brilliant at reporting records, and the rest of the world needs to get better at it. But it's actually interestingly listed as data deficient in the European Red List of Habitats. And that is not necessarily true. There's a lot of data out there, it's just not readily available. And I've been involved in a project called the Rehab Project, where we've been trying to rectify that. So we've spent years pulling together all of the existing records from the literature and the grey literature and everything as well as doing our own surveys to basically fill in the gaps throughout the whole global range. And I can say that it is actually far more widespread than this map would make you think. But that isn't publicly available yet. It will be becoming publicly available next year. So why should we care about this species? I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here. You guys are obviously here for a reason. You care about the environment and you care about species. Arguably, every species is important and valuable in its own right, for just its intrinsic, being. But often we have to justify why we have to protect some species and not others, because resources are not, they're finite effectively. But it's well known that this species is important for its habitat forming function. This image here shows you what the reefs look like at Duckpool in North Cornwall. And you can see here you've got some veneer forms living, looking quite healthy and happy, living on these rock structures here. But you can see there's a lot of red algae living in and amongst the reefs as well. And you have multiple things going on here. So you have organisms that can live on the rock, obviously. You've got organisms that can live on the reef structures of the Sabellaria itself. And these would be what we would refer to as epibiotic. Epi always refers to on top of, and biotic is obviously the life. But you also have the reef structures themselves. So the tubes, of course, can represent habitat for organisms that can live in and amongst tubes as well. And we refer to that type of organism as infaunal. Okay, so living in fauna, referring to animals. And it typically is describing animals, not seaweeds. You don't tend to get seaweeds living in and amongst the tubes, but you will get seaweeds living on the surface of the reefs. But you do have a situation where the reefs, when they're in full swing, and when I mean full swing, we've got every tube is occupied by an individual live worm. And they look very much like this. They've got this lovely sort of orangey color, and they're healthy in the sense that there's nothing really living on them. The reason that is because when you've got a live individual living in every tube, they of course are filtering their food from the water when the tide is in. So any algal spore or propagule that might, like a mussel, for instance, that might, come out of the water column and try to settle on the reef, it will get eaten by the worms because they have this natural filtering function. So when you have situations where they're in that retrograding phase, so when, not every tube is occupied by a live individual, algae, mussels, oysters, and other things will actually get a chance to actually live on the reef itself as well. So you have this sort of interesting situation where when they're in full prograding growth phase, very few organisms can actually live on the structure itself. But when they're in the declining phase, in the retrograding, algae and other organisms get a chance to live. And all sorts of organisms, I've just got some images here on the right of a few of the sort of beasties that will live in the infaunal groups that will live in the tubes, just showed here on the right. So you've got lots of different worms, loads and loads of worms, and crustaceans in particular will live in and amongst the reefs as well. And of course, here's a situation sort of showing you the differences here. So these are images here showing you probably predominantly prograding. Most of these tubes on the image here are housing live individual worms. But the patches here where you've got the green algae, you will have situations where the tubes will be dead. Effectively, there won't be live individuals in them. And that's providing an escape from grazing from these algae here. And you've got this interesting situation where see these white dots here, these are limpets, and the limpets will not necessarily graze readily on the Sabellaria. So the Sabellaria itself can provide a refuge from grazing from these key grazers here. And ultimately, I would predict that over time, these limpets are going to basically get overgrown by the Sabellaria. It's a very dominant species and is probably eventually going to encroach on these limpet patches. So there's quite interesting dynamics going on between the Sabellaria itself, other organisms that will live on and in the reefs, and other organisms living on the rocks that also interact with the Sabellaria and other species as well. So there's quite a complex dynamic going on there. And there's just a sort of a close-up showing you some very, I would say those limpets are in danger of being completely overgrown and possibly actually dying as a result, unless they are able to actually get out and move across the Sabellaria and find a new patch of rock. They are definitely doomed. They also carry out really important functions that we consider important as humans. So biofiltration describes, they basically filter their food out of the water column. And of course, that has an important function in terms of removing all sorts of microbes and sediments that can help us to have more clear water. And of course, people like to look at clean, clear water. And Devon and Cornwall are famous for having really beautiful clear water, and Sabellaria will be playing a role, of course, in that when you have it in abundance. And of course, just not as a sort of a side product of that, you will of course get very important nutrient cycling. Sabellaria take water and nutrients from the water column, and ultimately it will get deposited on the seafloor as feces, of course, coming out of the individual worms as well. So that's a very important function that they carry out that is valued by humans. We would consider that an ecosystem service is the term that we would refer to it as. And of course, when they form, this is showing you really good examples of the mushroom forms, when and where it does form reef, or the mushrooms like this, of course, it can provide a coastal protection function and help prevent coastal erosion in some places as well. And of course, if the coastline is susceptible to erosion and there are houses and infrastructure in the vicinity, of course, we as humans would clearly value this as a service, an ecosystem service provided by this species. So what can we do about it? And what can we do for this species? Well, of course, conservation is crucial. And a key part of conservation is, of course, research and education. I've been amazed on my travels around Ireland and Britain and various other places about people's knowledge of the worm. A lot of people think it's coral, and it's completely understandable why people think it's coral. It forms reef. It looks beautiful, and it's analogous to coral in many ways. And a lot of the time, when you tell people that it's a worm, and you tell them the size of the worm, they're amazed, and they're really interested, and they're enthralled by it. But it has struck me from talking to people that it's actually not that well known, and people don't really know a lot about it. And if you don't know a lot about something, or if you don't even know that it's a worm, for instance, it's very hard to get people to care about things. And arguably, a lot of people probably wouldn't care about worms. A lot of people care about the more charismatic organisms. So I think there's a lot to be done in like exactly what you guys are doing. Having events like this, having speakers, doing coastal walks, and all of this kind of stuff is great for engaging people with the marine environment. But of course, I think preaching to the choir, we're all interested people here. It's trying to engage other people. That's the issue. And things like information boards can be a key part of that. Certainly, we take our students to South Africa every year, and everywhere you go in South Africa, there's information boards everywhere around the coast. And these are huge things. They're really, really big information boards. I think we could be a lot better at putting up information boards in the UK that can help with the conservation effort. Responsible interaction with the shore, of course. Sabellaria is quite susceptible to trampling. Trampling can be very damaging to the reefs because it can, of course, bounce back, and they will just rebuild their tubes. But when they're rebuilding their tubes, they're not feeding. So, they're wasting energy when they could be doing other things. So trampling is a big threat to this species. And of course, in Britain, people love to spend time on the shore. And I've been I've been sampling for Sabellaria sometimes when I see school groups coming out. And I remember once counting at least 60 children on top of a Sabellaria reef at one moment. And I was like, oh, I'm not, of course, it's wonderful having kids on the shore, but with an information board, maybe we could encourage people to maybe be more careful around the reefs, for instance, to just warn people that they are quite vulnerable. And of course, marine protected areas, of which there are many around the UK, for which Sabellaria has, of course, been designated. And 9 in England alone have been designated just purely for Sabellaria alveolata. But of course, within marine protected areas, of course, there has to be some care taken to looking after the species that have been designated. Certainly in Ireland, I was in a marine protected area where I came across a bait collector. Sorry, not a bait collector. He was collecting Littorina littorea, winkles, and the site was designated for Sabellaria alveolata. It was by far the best site in the whole of Ireland for Sabellaria alveolata, but he was using his boot to kick off sections of the reef to break it apart to try and find the winkles, because they hide under the reef. And I didn't say anything to him, but I just was like, oh no, this is in a marine protected area and somebody's like really actively damaging the reef. But that takes money, that takes time, that takes enforcement. But yeah, maybe if there were information boards there, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And there were no information boards there about Sabellaria. So conservation is critical, and there's lots that we can do to help. But the key underpinning sort of point about conservation is knowing where it is. So remember I was saying we've been working as part of this rehab project on trying to piece together the global distribution of the species through basically looking through the literature and the old records and doing surveys. And this is, I'm pleased to say, this is what the current global distribution looks like. Very different to that first map that I showed you, where it looked like it was absent from pretty much the whole of the Spanish and French coastline and the Portuguese coastline. You can see that it is much more widespread than that map would have suggested. And we are still happy to collect records. We've been encouraging members of the public to submit their records to the database. If you're interested, you can see the website here. It's just www.honeycombworms.org. And yeah, the records are being used for a good purpose. And you can see here that, yeah, we've filled in some major knowledge gaps on this species globally as a result. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to say thank you. Thanks to Robin for inviting me to give this talk, and to everyone at Coastwise North Devon, various people who've worked on this project, or various projects, and to you guys for listening and for the opportunity to talk to you.